Rebuilding and updating
Didn't fix it? So he was having the same issue, and he did his Visual Studio update to version 3, or release 3, or update 3, whatever it's called, and that took care of his. So you may need to update your Visual Studio. As silly as that sounds, that might be your best first step. Alright, so it's been a while since I've built an extension. So I'll warn you that I may have to do an additional bit of referencing and looking things up, but that's good for you guys to see. So HTML helpers are considered extensions. If you actually look at the markup when you're building your view, if we do HTML dot, you'll see in this little pop-up it says extension in parentheses. And it's an extension on the MVC HTML, no, scratch that, extension. MVC HTML string is what's returned, and then HTML helper T model is what is actually being extended. Is this HTML helper T model, and then it says drop down list 4, and then you get into all that jazz. The idea here is that we're writing a method to extend the HTML helper class. And the difference is that we don't have access to the HTML helper class itself. We can't actually go in and add a method. But instead, what we can do is we can create these extension methods, which are static methods that live in a class somewhere else, but they're specifically designed to work and interact with the HTML helper. Okay? So since that probably doesn't mean a whole lot, let me give you the physical example. But the goal is that we want to extend it. So to do it, we have to start off with a class. So I'm actually going to create a folder. I'm going to call it extensions. And then inside of that folder, I'm going to create a class. I'm going to call it my HTML helpers. I'm going to make it a static class, and then I'm going to create a static method. Public static, and this is going to return an MVC HTML string. And the reason I knew to use that was, again, if I go back and look at this one for the text box 4, the return type for this function, this is actually drop down list 4, but it doesn't matter, is MVC HTML string. That's the return type that I want to return. So I'm just going to call it button for right now. Yep.
Did you make the extension folders yourself?
Yes. I right-clicked, add folder.
Under anywhere particular?
I just did it right off the root. So the thing you have to also kind of remember, and this is even hard for me to recall, is that while the controllers and the views, it's really important to keep in the models not so much, but controllers and views, it's important to keep that structure. It's important especially for the views because MVC is expecting that structure. Controllers, there's some flexibility. Models, it really doesn't care. And then any other class files, CS files that you make, you can put them wherever you want inside. Because at the end of the day, they all get compiled and shoved inside of a DLL file anyway. So you can think of it just like any sort of class library project from that respect. All right, so we have MVC HTML button. Actually, let's go ahead and do button 4. And then I'm going to do parentheses for my parameters. The first parameter has to be what I'm writing the helper for. And in this case, I'm writing it for HTML helper that takes a T model. And then string button name. All right, so generics is what our T model is. That's why it's in the angle brackets. In order for us to be able to utilize this generic, we actually have to add the generic to our method name. So we do button 4 bracket T model. And then what it's doing now is it's just complaining that we're not returning anything. So we'll return new new MVC HTML string. And the string value is some value. So that at least makes the Visual Studio compiler checker happy. Oh, I forgot to give that a name. So that's my helper. So I've got two parameters coming in. The first one is my HTML helper. I'm calling him the helper. The second one is the string, which will be the button name. I'm returning a new MVC HTML string. That constructor requires a string. So to generate our markup, it's really as simple as us going in here and saying button, and then we can do name equals button name plus ID equals button name plus value equals button name plus sign button name plus button. Right? I did neglect one thing. We have to add the quotes around them. So to do that, we have to escape them with a backslash quote. I'm basically going to just kind of decorate this. Make it a little more readable. Okay. So it's a fair bit of string concatenation, nothing fancy. It should look to you at least somewhat like HTML. You see it in there. So now if we jump back to our login, do you guys need me to give you more time here?
Yeah.
All right, so we've got this extension written. So now we should be able to come back here, and I'm just going to comment this out. Replace it with HTML button 4. Now it doesn't come up right away, which is, for me, it seems like it's a 50-50 shot. So the first thing I always like to do is do a build. Do a build of the system, see if that takes care of it. HTML, still didn't get it. When you write custom extensions, you have to register those extensions, and that's done under the web config, not the main web config, which is at the root of your site, but there's actually another web config inside of your views folder. That web config has the space for you to add namespaces. Those namespaces are where the view will go and look to find the elements for extensions and things like that. Since I went ahead and put it inside of a folder called extensions, my namespace is actually 15fs_class_project.extensions. That's my namespace. So I have to add that here. Now that isn't necessarily used by the runtime. It is definitely used by Visual Studio. I think it is used by the runtime, but you first see it in Visual Studio as you're coding. So we'll come back here, we'll do another build for good measure. And then we'll come back and add HTML.button. Oh, come on.
Let's try this. Close. I'm gonna go ahead and run it and see if it gives me any hints as to why it can't find it. I'm gonna try creating a second extension. I think I said it, never typed it. Save F6. There it is. Okay. Because it's an extension, you identify it as an extension by using the this keyword in your parameter list. So this HTML helper is what I'm extending. Then from there, the helper, and then this is the additional parameter. So that gets transformed when I actually use it to look something like this. It drops the first parameter, and it just picks up after, because the first parameter is implied because it's the helper. So the way that that function works, if you think about it, is that it's static. So it's not attached to a particular instance, first of all. Second, the helper, this HTML helper, which is a property, the HTML part, it actually gets passed to the function as the first parameter. It passes in the HTML helper to be the first parameter to our button for function, followed by all of these other parameters. So submit ends up becoming the second parameter for our button. So let's save that. Let's rerun. So there's our button. So if you look at it, name, ID, value, and then the actual text. So what I was commenting about during the lecture earlier was, well, what if we want to go in and stylize this in a particular way? Well, if we had done straight HTML, we'd have to go around and find all the buttons and make the adjustment to all the buttons. In this case, we can make the adjustment here, and then it gets picked up everywhere. So I'm actually going to drop that since we don't need it. I'll come in here and I'll say style equals btn default. And just inject it right in there. Let me rebuild, refresh.
said style. Should be class. Rebuild. Reload. So now every time I use that helper, my button picks up that new style. But we don't just have to use the one property. We can actually go in and add additional properties. So we can say button name, then we can say string, button style. And we can say the default value is default, which basically makes the button style an optional call. So we're setting a default value to button style. We're saying that it defaults to the word default. Then in here, we can do plus button style, and then let the user pass in the style they want. Because within Bootstrap, you have default, primary, success, warning, and danger, and info. Yeah. So you can actually choose any one of those. So we can go this route, and in theory, if we just build and flip back and refresh, even though we've made that code change, the code we had is still good. And we get the same result. So that's a non-breaking change. At least the goal was to be a non-breaking change. But if we decide we want to say, you know, I'd rather this really be a primary, make that change, refresh, and now the button should be styled as the primary style. And it turned gray. That's the default. We can change that to be success, which I believe is like a shade of green. Or it's also gray.
It's underscores, or sorry, lowercase success.
Oh. Thank you. There we go. Thank you. So primary would be the same then. So now it's blue. So in theory, we can take it even one step further. Since I don't know how to type correctly, we can come in here and we can define public, how do we want to do this? Enum button styles. And we can do default, comma, primary, success, info, warning, danger. So we can now take button styles here, and instead of taking a string, we'll take a button styles type, and we can set that default to be default. Now in theory, this is untested, so I'm going to take a shot in the dark. I think the binding system will pick up the string and convert it to... No, it won't. Okay. Sometimes it converts your enums and sometimes it doesn't, so I didn't know if it would do it. But that's okay. So then we come in here, and we just say, comma, and they'll say, now we're looking for a button style. So button style dot danger, let's say. And we actually have one other change to make. We'll call toString explicitly. And rebuild. So then now we're getting a more isolated result. We get the result we want, but then we're isolating ourselves in terms of what those button styles would be. typing the wrong string in and it doesn't work. So you can do the same thing with a lot of other extensions. You can even create, maybe you have a particular module type, you know, something that has a frame and a header and all of those components, where you would typically put down a div and then another div and then, you know, like the nav bar, for example. You know, that had like 5 divs with a whole bunch of styles and a whole bunch of something else. Well, maybe there's a case where you want to replicate that in multiple spots within your app. You create a custom extension, set up the appropriate parameters, and then you just plug and chug that instead of putting a whole bunch of divs and then missing one and forgetting the right layout. So the helpers actually give you a lot of flexibility. Again, being able to go back and then say, well, I've decided to change out this style framework for this style framework. Well, I make one adjustment, and then it updates the entire look of the website. So that's the idea with the extensions. I actually had an extension, just to kind of give you a real world example. I had an extension that I wrote because I was building a system for a school where it was an online tool for them to build tests. And every question, while they were different question types, had the same general structure. So what I did is I created an extension that built out the shell of that question on the page. So think of it like a module or a row on the page. So it always took a header, it always took this, it always took that, and I could take my view model and pass it into the extension, into the helper for the question, and it would actually have the logic to parse the view model, and then it would actually be smart enough to say, oh, you're using this type of partial view, and then it would inject the partial view inside of the extension of the HTML helper. So basically it was one line of code, here's the view model, and then it had enough logic to go in and grab the right partial, build the frame, and then inject the partial into the layout. So it was one line of code instead of writing it was literally probably about 20 lines of code per question. And then if I made changes to the layout, I'd make it in one place, and then it would update across the entire system. So in that case, that's a definite time save, because even if you're utilizing the same components across multiple pages, having these helpers allows you to only touch it in one spot instead of having to go back for n number of pages that you may have in your site. So, all right, any questions around that? Anything I jumped over too fast? Like I said, they're not hard, they're not fancy when you really look at the guts, but understanding the mechanics of how they work and obviously remembering to bring in your namespace and make them actual extensions is always a big help. All right, that's all I got, guys.